Today we are talking about how the absolute mind generates reality. This is going to be a great topic, and it's extremely important information that you need to know as we talk about how reality itself is generated from the absolute mind, which is what we are as the collective. And we're going to talk about the mechanics behind it, how it happens. We're going to be talking a lot about frequency patterns and holograms. It's going to be great. This is extremely important information. Now, of course, we're continuing to read the Gateway Process Declassified CIA document, which is going to touch on this topic as well. We're going to be talking about its interpretation, but then how we understand reality as well. And this is really important stuff to know, because if you want to know about where you are, why you are here, you have to know what existence is. Because if you don't know what existence is, you can't make the optimal choices based on what life is. And the thing that's very important to understand with this is it's critical for reaching a new level of consciousness. Why? We talked a little bit about this last time. So last time we talked about what higher consciousness is in terms of developing an analog all. So we talked about what self-consciousness is. You generate a conceptual model of yourself called the analog I, and you're able to use this conceptual model of yourself to think about the future, project into the future, pull up memories from the past. And then we talked about the analog all, which humanity now needs to develop, which is a conceptual model of all reality that everyone builds and one associates oneself with. So why is it important? What is having to know what reality is important? Because knowing what reality is goes towards building that conceptual model of all reality that one associates oneself with. So this is necessary information to reach higher consciousness. It's necessary to be able to build that analog all, at least in any accurate sort of way. We want it to be accurate, because if we all have very inaccurate, disharmonious, incongruent analog alls, that defeats the whole purpose. We want all of our conceptual models of reality to start to converge and be as close to each other as possible. So we're talking about how the absolute mind, which is what we are, generates reality. We're going to be talking about intervening dimensions, frequency domains, etc. It's going to be great. Real quick, before we begin, I want to remind you, hey, if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Please hit the like button. And if you enjoy my work, consider supporting on Patreon. You'll get access to weekly secret videos, an archive of all the secret videos we've done, and it helps out a lot. It's the best way to support my work. There's a lot more too. Also, I want to remind you, there's a lot of scams going around. If people in the chat or in the comments say that they're pretend to be me, they're telling you to join their Telegram or WhatsApp, that's not me. That's a scam. Don't fall for that, guys. Also, there's a lot of people and groups out there spreading disinformation and misinformation about us because they don't want this knowledge to get out there. So be smart, be on the lookout. Don't believe that bullshit. And here we go. All right, so we're going to bring this up. Now, like I said, last week we talked about developing the analog all. Now we're talking about the absolute. And I'm just going to read a little bit from this. Once again, this is the Gateway Process Declassified CIA document. And well, just to be clear, once again, I'm not saying that everything in this document is correct. It's not. There's some stuff that isn't, and there's some stuff that's very outdated, but there's a lot of really interesting information that gives us opportunity to talk about important knowledge that is required to reach a higher consciousness and understand how existence operates. So I'm going to read this quickly, and then I'll explain it. Okay. So if some of this sounds just like a lot of word salad, just go with it. I'm going to break it down. So it says here, physicists, okay, let's see. To explain how and why human consciousness can be brought to transcend the limitations of time-space is the next task that we must address. To do this, we must first appreciate what time and space are in order to understand how the dimension that they constitute can be transcended. So this is not exactly what I'm saying, but it's close. It's in the ballpark. It's saying, hey, if you want to know how space and time can be transcended, you have to know what space and time are. It's not exactly what I've been saying, but it's similar to me saying, If you want to reach a higher consciousness, you have to understand what consciousness is. You have to build that model. You have to have the necessary theory underlying it. So physicists define time as a measurement of energy or force in motion. In other words, it's a measurement of change. Energy, which is not confined, is a force without limit, without dimension, without the limits of form. It is infinity. It cannot move because there is nothing beyond infinity, and is therefore outside of the dimension of time. It is also beyond space because that concept implies that the specific energy form is limited to a specific location and is absent from other locations. But if energy is in the state of infinity, there are no boundaries, no here to differentiate from there, no sense of area. Energy in infinity means energy uniformly extended without limit. It has no beginning, no end, no location. It is conscious force, the fundamental primal power of existence without form, a state of infinite being. Energy in infinity is said to be completely at rest and therefore cannot generate holograms so long as it remains utterly inactive. Once again, if you're getting a little lost, don't worry. I'm just doing a summary. This is important information that we're going to break down. It retains its inherent capacity for consciousness in that it can receive and passively perceive holograms generated by energy and motion out in the various dimensions which make up the active universe. Energy in this state of inactive infinity is termed by physicists as energy in its absolute state, or simply the absolute. Between the absolute, various intervening dimensions in which human consciousness and altered states of being may gain access. Theoretically, human consciousness may continue to expand the horizons of its perceptual capability until it reaches the dimension of the absolute, at which point perception stops because the absolute generates no holograms of or about itself. Okay. A lot of information here. Let's unpack it. There's a lot to explore. So first of all, they're talking about different types of energy, and they're defining something that they call energy in infinity, and they are associating energy in infinity as being the primal aspect, the most fundamental aspect of existence, and they associate it with what they call the absolute. Okay, so hold on, wait a minute. What is the absolute? So they said something about physicists terming energy at rest as the absolute. I'm not familiar with that. I'm not familiar with physicists using the term the absolute to refer to that. So I'm not really sure what he's talking about there. Perhaps he's mistaken, or he's talking about a very specific theory of some physicists that might be more obscure. But the absolute is an idea in philosophy, and it's really popularized by the philosopher Hegel. What is the absolute for Hegel? The absolute is the fundamental reality. It is in essence God, but not God like in the Bible, just the primary, foundational, generative aspect of reality. So the absolute is all reality, according to Hegel, that generates for itself a world from itself. So for Hegel, the absolute, all reality, is a structured system of what he calls logic, which is structured reason, which he calls the idea. The idea then others itself into nature, and then within nature, it places itself inside its own generated world via consciousness, the consciousness of human beings, and the collective consciousness of human beings Hegel calls spirit. So spirit is the collective consciousness of human beings. So for the philosopher Hegel, the absolute is all reality. Its structured, formal aspect, which you could think of like the code of existence, he calls the idea. The idea others itself into what he calls nature, which is the physical world. You can think of that like the code generating a video game environment. And then within that video game environment, or within nature, arises consciousness, which is the consciousness of the absolute. And that collective consciousness that constitutes the entire collective of humanity, Hegel calls spirit. And so the absolute is within its own dream world that it generated from itself through us. but it doesn't realize that it is the absolute yet until it comes to know that it is. And that's what I talk about. This is the next stage of evolution that humanity must reach, by realizing that it is the absolute. See, human beings became self-aware. They were like, oh, I am a me. I am separate from the environment. I am not you. But it hasn't realized yet, oh, we are the absolute. We generated this world from ourselves and for ourselves. Humanity hasn't reached that stage yet. And this is why they're killing each other, because they don't realize that they're all actually just different perspectives of each other. Now, even though we are all eternal individual units. We all have eternal selves. We're different nodes, eternal nodes of an absolute network mind. The absolute network mind is not something separate from us. It is what we are. So the term the absolute fits in well with what they're talking about in the gateway process, because in the gateway process, they are talking about a system of energy that they're calling the absolute, that generates an internal hologram of itself that it then explores through itself. So you can see this is really just what Hegel was talking about, just put in terms of modern technology, such as self-generating holograms and energy and frequency, etc. So we're really going to break this down and look at this in detail here, but I want to set out the preliminary. And remember, there's so much to talk about. I'm just going to give generalizations because I want you guys to get the big picture. So keep in mind that everything I talk about, I could talk about for like 3 hours every single topic, but I want to give you guys the big picture here so you can start building that conceptual model of what existence is. That's developing the analog all. That's when you start to develop that big picture of reality, you start to develop an analog all. You start to develop a sense of the all. Just like you develop an analog I when you start to get a sense of yourself. Oh, that's me in the reflection, not you. And you start to build a conceptual model of what it means to be you. Well, what we're doing here is building a conceptual model of being the absolute together. That's why this is important. It brings you to a higher consciousness. It doesn't automatically do it. Like you actually have to put in the work and the understanding. It just doesn't automatically happen. But, so we're gonna talk about this now, and there's one thing that I have to point out that makes this slightly confusing. So in our system, we use the term the absolute and the source. Okay, these are two terms that we use: the absolute and the source. They use the term the absolute. When they say the absolute, they're talking about what we refer to as the source. Now, there is a subtle difference here, and I will explain it. Don't let that be confusing. When it needs to be explained, I will. It's not that big of a deal, but I just want to point that out for those who might be familiar with our system. They're using it slightly differently here. I'll point out what that difference is. Okay, so we're talking about the absolute, and the absolute being energy infinity. So what are they talking about here? Well, they're talking about what they're talking about. I'm going to explain this in terms of our system. So in terms of our system, what is the absolute? In terms of our system, the absolute is all reality. It's everything. Specifically, the source is that fundamental aspect of existence. It's the base reality. It is the ground of existence. And it is the necessary eternal aspect of the absolute. It is the eternal aspect of the absolute. So just like there's different components to you, you are an eternal mind that has a body. So there's different aspects of what you are. You are an eternal mind, you have a body, and we could refer to different aspects of you. We could refer to you as a mind, we could refer to your body, or we could refer to you as a totality, like the whole complex of you being a mind and body. So the absolute is what we refer to as all reality. There's the source, there's the various intervening frequency domains, there's the holos, all associated space-time domains, and the absolute is all that. In other words, to put it simply, when you look at the different aspects of reality, like, oh, the code, or the video game world, or the consciousness that is experiencing the video game world. You see how there's like 3 different aspects? Well, the absolute is all those things. It's the code, it's the game world, and it is what is experiencing the game world. It's all that. In this document, they refer to the absolute as only being the fundamental code aspect. We refer to that as the source. So let's talk about this in terms of holograms. So before we talk about holograms, so let's talk about frequency real quick. So to say that the source, what they refer to as the absolute, but the source, to say that the source is the energy in infinity or the fundamental aspect of reality, what does that mean? Well, I'll tell you what it means in our system. In our system, it is the basic building blocks of existence. In other words, it is the pure sinusoidal waves, pure sines and cosines. Now, these are the most basic waveforms that you can get. They are the basic, fundamental, eternal waveforms. Now, these are in motion. This says that they're not in motion. They are in motion, but they're unchanging. And I think that that is what is important there. Now, motion inherently involves change, but what I mean by unchanging is the trajectory of that motion does not change. So reality is a synthesis of all what seems like contradictions, but aren't actually contradictions. So you can have something that is moving, which constitutes change. But if its trajectory is changeless, well, you can say that that part of it is changeless. So there's a changing aspect and a changeless aspect. The trajectory is changeless, it's eternal, and it's constantly in that motion, but of a trajectory that doesn't change. Okay, that doesn't really matter too much, though. What's important is that these basic sines and cosines can be combined together to create any wave structure, no matter how complex. So in mathematics, this is known as Fourier mathematics. Fourier mathematics is incredibly important. It's used everywhere, from your Wi-Fi connection to your cellular phone to radio waves to just about everything you can possibly imagine. Image processing uses a Fourier transform in Fourier mathematics. So what is Fourier transform? What is Fourier mathematics? It's the mathematics of waveforms. And what this says is if you have the basic sines and cosines, these basic waves, if you combine them together, you can create any wave structure, no matter how complicated. So that means we can take these waves and create an intricately complex wave pattern, for example, as complicated as the universe itself. So these very basic waves are the building blocks that give rise to everything. Now, I'm going to throw something in there real quick. You might be wondering, how do these waves exist? Where did they come from? To summarize it very quickly in something that would take hours, to try and summarize it really quickly, is that they exist and are eternal because they are a mathematical concept that nulls to zero or nets out to zero. So what I mean by that is, if you were to examine these sinusoidal waves and integrate over a cycle, you would find out that they are equivalent to zero. So in other words, there's structured nothingness, and because there's structured nothingness, logically they can exist because it's structured void. It's nothingness expressed in a certain way. So once again, this is something that could take a really long time to explain, but real quick, because I think a lot of people are going to be like, where did these waves come from? They didn't come from anywhere. They're eternal because they're structured void, structured nothingness. This structured void, this structured nothingness can then be combined to create the illusion of the material world, but it's actually still just more complicated nothingness. That's how reality can exist, because it doesn't actually exist in the way that people think of existence as existing independently from mind. It doesn't. It's all a kind of mental self-generated illusion that's structured nothingness. So you have reality that from the source is the eternal building blocks of existence, these waveforms that give rise Here's a really good analogy if this is feeling a little complicated. Think about a piano. If you think about a piano has many, many, many keys. Now those keys are all associated with a frequency. So all those keys, they're not changing. Those keys just sit there, and they're all associated with the same frequency. If you press one key, it makes a certain sound. If you press another key, it also makes a different sound. Every key you make makes a different sound. When you push two keys together, you create a new sound from the combination of those two tones. And when you press more keys, you create a more complex sound. And the more keys that you press in different patterns create more complex sounds until you create beautiful, intricate music, a very complex wave structure. So you have these very basic keys, and the music depends on these keys for their existence. If you didn't have these frequencies, if you didn't have these fundamental frequencies, you wouldn't be able to make the song. You wouldn't be able to make the music. So that's kind of like the key. The piano keys are like the source, and the music is like the physical world or the holos. The physical world or the holos depends on the keys for their existence. The physical world and the holos can stop existing if the keys stop playing, but those keys are always there. They always exist. They're eternal. That's kind of like what the source is. Now, real quick, the document says that human consciousness can expand the horizons of perceptual capability until it reaches the dimension of the absolute. But remember, when they say the absolute, they really mean what we refer to as the source. So human consciousness may continue to expand the horizons of its perceptual capability until it reaches the dimension of the source, at which point perception stops because the absolute generates no holograms of or about itself. Okay, real quick, I want to mention that, clear that up real quick. What this means is if you are in a meditative state or some kind of state where you're tuning into different modes of existence and you tune all the way to the source, what are you going to experience? You're going to experience the pure white light of the source because you're accessing the fundamental, basic, bare building blocks of reality. Now, from that, it generates a hologram, but it's not a hologram of itself. What itself is that pure bareness. That pure, a lot of people talk about these in different traditions or near-death experiences or psychedelic states. I myself have experienced this in psychedelic states. Remember, don't do anything dangerous or illegal. But this is where you're experiencing the pure source, the fundamental aspect of existence. And the reason why it's that pure white light is because it's the fundamental, the pure fundamental frequencies, the pure fundamental sinusoidal waves. And it itself doesn't generate a hologram of itself. It generates a hologram of something else, but not itself, because what it is just those basic building blocks. Another way you can kind of understand it too is it's sort of like Legos. If you take Legos, you can take very basic blocks and build super complicated structures and then break them all down into the blocks again. That's kind of like the pure waves of the source that can be taken and built into structures or taken down into their pure form again. The musical analogy, though, is the best. So what we all are eternal minds. What does it mean to be an eternal mind? We're a being of frequencies. What are frequencies? These are these fundamental frequencies of existence. So each one of us is a source. The source is the collection of all of us. So all of us together is the source, but each one of us has our own source. So we are a source, but us together, taken together, that is the source. Okay. So we generate reality. Reality is generated from our core material, from us. So it's generated from ourselves. So just like when you go to sleep and dream, you're exploring a dream world generated from yourself. This collective domain is a world generated from our frequency patterns interacting. You can imagine like each one of us is a piano. And as we all play our songs, those songs come together to create one large song. When you go to sleep and dream, you're only listening to your song, your piano. When you are awake and tuned into the physical world, you're listening to the song generated by all the pianos playing together. You're tuning in to different aspects of the song that you're listening to, just your personal song or the collective song. So this is why I talk a lot about that humanity needs to develop the ability to tune, because right now it only really has a binary tuning function. It can tune to the physical world of the holos, or it tunes to its own dream world. But there are many different aspects of reality that we can learn to tune to. The tuning to the source is an example of another aspect that we can tune to. Tuning to the source. We're not tuning to our music or the music of the collective. We're just tuning to the pure keys, the pure frequencies. That's that pure white light of the source. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about holograms. Okay, this is important. Let's talk a little bit about holograms. So let's see. I have a diagram of a hologram up on screen, and I want you to focus on 3 points, three elements here. I want you to notice right here, there is a laser. Then there's this line, which is a holographic plate. And then you see that there's an eye looking through the plate here, and then these chess pieces are the hologram that's generated. So really, I just want you to focus on 3 things. There's the laser. The laser shines onto the holographic plate, and when it does, it gives rise to the holographic image. So if you imagine, just imagine, to try and give you some 3-dimensional depiction, say this is a laser, like a laser pointer, and say this is the holographic plate, okay? So the laser, you turn it on, and it shines on the holographic plate, and then it generates the holographic image. So what's actually happening here is that you have the laser, which is also called the source. The holographic plate supplies an interference pattern. So there is an interference pattern, which are a pattern of waveforms. That's what an interference pattern is. It's a pattern of waveforms. These patterns of waveforms have been embedded into the holographic plate when the hologram was created. And when you add light to these, this interference pattern, you get a reconstruction of the holographic image. Essentially what that means is that through an interference pattern or through wave patterns contains the information or code necessary to generate the illusion of a 3-dimensional object. So you have the source, the laser shines onto the holographic plate, which contains the information to generate the holographic image. Now, this is reality works in a very similar way. So it's a really good example to use because it works in a really similar way. You have the source, which are just the pure frequencies. Okay, so let's break these 3 aspects down into what we know about reality. There's the source, there's the frequency domain, and then there's the holos. Just like there's the laser, the holographic plate, and then the holographic image. Okay, so you have the source, you have the frequency domain, and then you have the holos. Alternatively, you have the source, you have the domain of mind, and you have the physical domain. Okay, the frequency domain is the domain of mind, and the holos is the physical domain, the so-called physical domain. So the source is the fundamental building blocks of reality. It contains the fundamental frequencies of reality. The frequency domain is the particular way those frequencies combine, and then, which is mind, and then the so-called physical domain is the space-time transformation or representation of that information. It's this information that's contained here represented in a certain way. It's the information of mind represented or projected as a world that we can experience locally in terms of space and time. Now, it's important to remember that even though I'm showing you these objects in a physical space, like, oh, here is the source, and here is the frequency domain, and over here is the holos. Remember, that's just because I'm trying to give you guys an example. This is all an internal process and is self-contained. None of these things are separate, and nothing is projected out there. It's all internal. And so let me give you an example in terms of when you go to sleep and dream. When you go to sleep and dream, you have the fundamental frequencies that make you up, that are what you are, the source of you, those building blocks. Then you have the particular way in which your mind is arranged. That's the interference pattern. That's all the data that you've acquired throughout your life, all the experiences that you've had, all your memories. That's all in the frequency domain, in the information. And then your dream world is the experiential local domain that you are able to experience, that is built up from all that information in your mind, all your experiences, all your memories. Your dream world is a projection of your unconscious mind. Now, you can experience the frequency domain as well, but it's a different kind of experience. When you experience the transform of the frequency domain or the space-time domain, it's like a world. It's like you know, you can walk around, you can go from one side of the room to the other side of the room. It's a world. A frequency domain is experienced more like fractal patterns. You can understand it. You know, if you've had a psychedelic experience, you've seen, you know, these beautiful fractal images and transforming patterns. This is the frequency domain. It's information that's represented in a different way. You see, you can have the information represented as an interference pattern or as the hologram. You can have frequency information or space-time information. And that's another thing that I have to point out real quick. See, in Fourier mathematics, remember I told you in Fourier mathematics, you can take the basic building blocks of reality, in Fourier mathematics, you can take the basic sinusoidal waves and create any wave structure, no matter how complicated. Not only that, though, Fourier mathematics says that you can transform frequency information into space and or time information. In other words, you can take information, so you have the building blocks of reality, the pure sines and cosine waves. They can form a very complicated wave structure that is a frequency function, a function of mind, and then that function of mind can be represented or transformed as space and time information. So what does that really mean? When we talk about transforming information, it's sort of like this. If you're looking at this pen straight on, you're experiencing that pen in a certain way, but you can also experience a different transformation of that pen, such as this way, from the side. Rather than straight on, you're experiencing it from the side. There's the information that is the pen, but you're experiencing it in two different ways, two different forms, straight on or from the side. So when you're experiencing the world, you can experience the frequency domain, the mental domain, or the transform of that as the space-time domain. So you can have information of reality represented in different ways. So remember, as existence, we have the source, which are the pure fundamental frequencies of reality. Then you have the frequency domain, which is the domain of mind and the way those combine to form complex frequency functions. And then the transform of that, or that information represented in terms of space and time. So you see how you have these three main components. You have the source, you have the frequency domain, and then you have the 3D projected image, which is the holos, or the physical domain, or the space-time domain. But this is all happening internally. It's not out there. It's an internal experience. A hologram is a useful metaphor, but it's not exactly the same. It's not happening, you know, like in space. It's an internal projected hologram, but it's very, very, very similar. It works on the same mechanical principles. Okay, so notice there's three components. There's the source, there is the frequency domain, and then there is the holos. Okay, all of that, all three together, that's what we call the absolute. In our system, so in the CIA document, they're referring to the source as the absolute. In our system, we refer to the source as the source, and all of it, the source, the frequency domain, and its projection, that is what we call the absolute. Because in our system, the absolute is all reality. The source is just the source. The frequency domain is just the frequency domain. And the holos is just the holos. All of it together, that is the absolute. And we are the absolute, coming to know ourselves through ourselves. Now, one thing that I want you to notice, though, is that the source is what is eternal. All the other domains are contingent, and they are not necessarily eternal. The source is necessarily eternal. And what I mean by that is, so you have the hologram over here, right? You have the laser, it's shining on the holographic plate, and it's forming the hologram. If you were to turn that laser off, the hologram would disappear, because the hologram is dependent upon that laser for its existence. Now, this is where the analogy breaks down just a little bit, because if you turn the laser off, well, you would still have the holographic plate. But in our metaphor, or in actual reality, what I should say, is that if you were to turn off the source, or turn off, if you were to turn off the source, not only would the hologram or the holos disappear, but so would the frequency domain, because the frequency domain is just the particular way in which the fundamental frequencies of the source are aligned. It's just like, if you look at the piano example again, the music, if you think of the music as, let's say, the frequency domain, it depends on the piano. If you get rid of the piano, the music disappears. So really, you just have the source, and from the source's self-interaction arises the frequency domain, and then the projection of that frequency domain is the holos. So it's all self-contained in the source. Now, you can say that the source is outside of the hologram, technically, because the source isn't literally inside of it, but it also permeates it because it is. And see, this is where, in this document, it says, since the absolute is conscious energy in infinity, it occupies every dimension to include the time-space dimension in which our physical existence, but we cannot perceive it. It overlays everything, as do many of the intervening gradients or dimensions through which the energies of the universe pass on their way to and from their home in the state of infinity, the absolute. So, in other words, remember, they use the term the absolute for what we use the source. I know that's a little confusing, so I apologize for that. They're very, very close concepts, but they're slightly different. So one thing that I want to throw out there, though, real quick before we move on, is that, remember, this is all generated from us and through us. So we are providing the fundamental frequencies. We are the source. We are each one of us as an individual eternal mind are providing the frequency data to generate this world. That's why we can't change the world just by thinking about it, because it's not ours to change. I mean, it is, but collectively, not individually. So, for example, think of us all as pianos again. If you go to sleep and dream and you're tuning into your own music, you can change the song because it's your keyboard to change. If you're tuning into the physical world, you can change your song, but you can't change everyone else's song. But there are so many songs playing that if you change your own song, it's not going to make a difference. That's not to mean you can't be important to the world. You absolutely can. I'm just talking about being able to, like, levitate a cup or something like that. People are like, well, if this is a dream, how come I can't levitate a cup or fly? It's because in a dream you can do that because you're in control of your frequencies. In this domain, when you're tuned into this domain, you're still in control of your frequencies, but your contribution is so small that it can't alter the fabric in a way that's perceptually measurable. Now, later in existence, when we evolve and grow and synchronize together and become a subnetwork mind, that will change. And what I want to get into is because right now I'm just talking about in terms of the source, a single frequency domain, and then the holos. But there are so we're just saying, like, oh, here's one. There's actually many different collective frequency domains. Not like multiverse. It's not like multiverse. It's a different concept. but many different intervening domains. Hold on, I'm just making a note to myself real quick for a talking point. Okay, so I want to show you this image here that, let me bring this up. So I think this is a really great image, if you can see this. This is an artistic depiction of kind of what's going on here. If you can see here, there's this eye, and it shows that this observer is actually the entire universe that has othered itself or projected itself out and is now perceiving itself, but it's perceiving itself as something other and different from itself. And see, this really puts together the problem that humanity has right now. It is perceiving itself, but it's thinking that it's something different. See, remember, human babies pass the mirror test, the test for self-awareness, by looking in the mirror and realizing, oh, that's me. And you know that they realize that because they put a little dot on the baby's head, and the baby sees itself in the mirror, sees the dot, and then reaches up to remove the dot because it realizes, oh, that's me. Why is there a dot on my head? Let me get rid of it. Whereas if a baby wasn't self-aware, it wouldn't do that because it wouldn't know that was a representation of itself. So human beings are self-aware. They can look in mirrors and realize, oh, that's me. But they are not yet in the state of all awareness. They have not developed the analog all. They have the analog I, the conceptual version of themselves, but they haven't developed the analog all yet, in which everything becomes your mirror. You realize, oh, I am me, but also I am reflected in the entirety of nature and also all of us together from the perspective of the absolute. So the absolute is the perspective of us as a collective. So we are all individual minds, but we form a single collective network. And if you think of the flower of life, that's a good example. Think of the flower of life pattern where there's a bunch of circles, but they all form one pattern. If you think of each circle as what we are, we're all individual minds, but we form one pattern. That's the absolute. We are the absolute and the individual minds as well. We are the overall pattern as well as the individual perspectives within that pattern. So developing all awareness constitutes a new kind of mirror test, in which in this mirror test, you are recognizing yourself in all of nature and every person in all reality, not just an actual literal mirror. So human beings don't have, just like those beings that aren't self-aware, self-conscious, can't recognize themselves in a mirror, human beings have not developed all awareness yet, and they haven't recognized themselves as they haven't passed the collective mirror test. So you can see that this is a really cool depiction of an observer seeing something that is apparently other than itself, but is actually generated from itself. So one has to come to the realization that what you're observing is you from the absolute perspective. That's very important. Right? There's different perspectives ones can have because we have different perspectives. We have the perspective of the overall pattern, the overall network, and then the individual nodes as well. Being individual eternal minds and being the overall network. We are both one and many. We are both individual and a unity. We are both together. And there's no logical contradiction here because you can see patterns like that are perfectly logically valid, like the flower of life that has individual units that form an overall pattern. So this is a really great depiction of what humanity needs to develop. I don't know if you can see, these aren't just white lines. These are like universes, not universes, I'm sorry, galaxies and star systems, etc. And then of course, I also just really liked this image that I used for the thumbnail. I think it's a really great depiction. You can think of the center of this being the development of that concept of all reality, the analog all. You can see this side, this more purple side, is like the frequency domain. It's the more metaphysical domain. And then this side is the more perceptual space-time holos domain, the domain of, it's the transform. This is being transformed into our perceptual experience. And it has the really beautiful colors of a rainbow here, kind of throwing idea to the idea of a prism, which is a transformation of information. But at the center of this, you have the development of the analog all, which is a conceptual pattern of all reality, which all humanity needs to be able to develop. And then you can also have, you need to have this synthesis of both reason and intuition, understanding the physical domains as well as the metaphysical domains as well. And all of this needs to come together to form this conceptual idea of reality. So in you understanding this information, hopefully what you're doing is constructing a concept of existence that you didn't have before. You just had a concept of self. But you're now constructing a concept of all reality, all existence. You're constructing a concept of the absolute. You see, you first constructed a concept of the self and you became self-aware. As you construct a concept of the absolute, you step into this all awareness, this absolute awareness. And our concepts of the absolute or the analog all should be as close to each other's as possible. All of our analog I's are different, but all of our analog alls should be as close to each other as possible, because it's a model of existence itself, and that is what will be the true and same for all of us versus our individual identities, which are different from all of us. We want to have both modes. We want to realize that we are one interconnected system and have the joy of experiencing each other in our diversity and individuality. See, that's why life is fun, because we realize, oh, we're all one interconnected network mind that's a unity, but we now have the joy of experiencing each other in our diversity and multiplicity. That's why diversity and multiplicity is a great thing and should be celebrated. It'd be like, that's why the different colors of the rainbow, even though they're all generated from the same, source of light, that white light's going to be really fucking boring if that's all you have. It's the beautiful, diverse rainbow that makes life interesting and wonderful and a joy to experience. Our diverse multiplicity is what allows us as a unity to have the joy of experiencing and learning from each other. And we are on a journey to become more unified, but that joy and process of learning in our diversification is what makes life interesting. That's why people are so screwed up today as they unalive and hate each other, because of differences in which we should instead be celebrating our diversity and learning from each other. Now, of course, you should never tolerate intolerance. That is a bad thing. That doesn't mean accept everyone's ideals. No, if you have hateful, sexist, racist ideals, that's not good. Those should be rejected. But we should have joy and not hate each other for our diversity, and we should be able to learn and grow from that. So what I want to talk about here, we talked a really basic overview of the source and the holos and the frequency domain, the physical domain, the mental domain, and the absolute in self-generating itself. What this document moves on next time, and what I would talk about next time, is intervening dimensions. So we talked just basically about the source and the frequency domain and the holos. Next time, we're going to talk about that it's more complex than that, because there is an entire field of CFDs or collective frequency domains. And this has to do with the future of humanity's evolution, a big part of why we're here and where we're headed, and how this will aid in our understanding of what we are, and ultimately show how we will have the power to construct our own reality, to literally construct our own universe. And that's what we're going to be talking about next time. Now, as always, hey, please like and subscribe. And if you enjoy my work, consider supporting on Patreon. It helps out a lot. You'll get access to weekly secret videos in the archive of all our secret videos. And check out all my videos. I have a lot more information on all this. I want to shout out everyone who does support on Patreon, especially Renaissance Fairy, Cassidy, Angela, Maria, Joel, Fairies of Venus, Fashida, and everyone else. You can also support on YouTube by hitting the join button right below this video. Thank you very much.